Although CSULB is home to many college students, including myself, it contains a dark history that is constantly overlooked. CSULB is built on Puvungna, the indigenous land of the Gabrielino/Tongva Nation, which many lack knowledge and awareness of. The Gabrielino-Tongva Nation expands across Southern California and is now known as the Los Angeles County and Orange County today. Despite being the rightful owners of their land, only about 1.6% of the population in Long Beach consists of Native Americans, and the majority of Long Beach is now home to about 50% of whites, 40% Latinx/Hispanic folks, 10% Black/African American folks, and the rest to other racial and ethnic backgrounds. I specifically aim to focus on this tribe and how the issue of stolen indigenous land is an environmental justice issue. Is what the protected Puvungna land looks like today. This sacred land is protected and is located across the hillside dorms and is near Lot G2 and the Japanese Garden of campus. Native Americans had to face the erasure of their people, culture, history, and spirituality. While facing these losses, colonizers were simultaneously using this stolen land to their benefit, where they stripped the land of its resources and ultimately harmed the land in order to create capital and profit for themselves. Heavily intertwined with the unjust seizure of indigenous land is environmental racism, which is when people of color and other marginalized communities like racial, ethnic, and gender minorities are at greater risk of being exposed to environmental toxins and hazards. When focusing on the case of Native Americans or indigenous people, white colonizers justify their actions through white supremacy, believing that they were entitled to steal and take ownership of Native American land due to their race. As a result, Native Americans were forced to relocate in areas with greater environmental hazards, such as being more exposed to polluted air, having a lack of access to clean water, and other environmental disparities that ultimately place their health and well-being at greater risk. Women and children of color are especially vulnerable to these concerns because gender roles and norms often cause women to have more frequent and direct contact with the environment, thereby increasing their risk of exposure to environmental problems. The genocide and displacement of indigenous peoples is also heavily linked with the decimation of the buffalo, as mentioned by Pello in his Critical Environmental Justice book. We can see that the displacement of Native Americans have costly effects to the environment, and specifically the environment's biodiversity, because the decimation of the buffalo was inherently linked to the decimation of Native Americans, as colonizers essentially targeted and slaughtered the buffalo to the point of extinction as a way to coerce Native Americans to hand over their land, since they were so dependent on the buffalo as a major resource for their survival. While there have been measures taken to protect this sacred land, issues with how the land is being treated and whether the university is truly dedicated to protecting this land still arises. For example, there were concerns about whether Puvungna was being used as a dumping ground for soil and trash just a few years ago. There also remains to be a considerable lack of knowledge and acknowledgement of the land and the history of colonization that this university is built on, as many people and students are unaware of the history behind the very campus that they step foot on. In addition to constantly pressuring the university to do a better job at educating students and the community members are taking action to continue to protect this land at all costs, and also have been making efforts in search of a steward to act as a caretaker for the land, but the university has yet to find someone at the moment. With all these environmental consequences resulting from colonization, the theft of indigenous land is unmistakably an environmental justice issue. The erasure of indigenous people continues to be a deep-seated problem within our society, where stories of colonization and wrongdoing are not acknowledged, and more effort is placed into hiding this history instead of unpacking and learning it to correct our mistakes. In order to take accountability and responsibility for our country's past wrongdoings, one of the first steps that we as individuals must do is acknowledge this history of America and educating ourselves on the environmental injustice that indigenous peoples face. CSULB as a university also has a responsibility to be dedicated and adamant on protecting the land and educating students about the history of the land it was built on top of. We must also take action to solve environmental injustice on a structural level by acknowledging the intersectionality of environmental injustice with other interlocking systems of oppression, in order to fully understand and be able to break down how they reinforce and allow each other to persist. Furthermore, we should be wary and limit our efforts to work with the state, as mentioned by Pello and Pulido, because it is often the source of the violence, oppression, and social injustices that we see. Some resources that are available at this university include the Puvungna Resource Center, where academic and cultural resources and a community for Native American students is provided. CSULB also has an annual powwow celebration that occurs every spring, where Indigenous culture is celebrated, appreciated, and learned about. Even though the theft of Indigenous land is not typically thought of as an environmental justice issue, recognizing and giving rightful ownership to Indigenous people and Native Americans is a crucial part of achieving environmental justice, as we as individuals have a responsibility to acknowledge, educate, and protect the Indigenous community and their land from any more harm.